collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
Coming up on the programme this week, we speak to two of the panellists at a recent conference held in Nicosia on national, international and human security in the Eastern Mediterranean. Silvia Colombo from the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome.
The extent to which the regime in Saudi Arabia, the monarchy, is trying, to secure its position vis-à-vis a growingly mobilized society is what is driving its foreign policy and its domestic politics.
And Isa Blumi from Stockholm University.
It is an inaccuracy, to say the least, that Iran is directly involved in the affairs of Yemeni resistance to Saudi Arabia. It is very much a long-standing relationship, hostile relationship between Saudi Arabia and its neighbours to the south.
And it may be nothing like traditional Greek drama, but it seems that Cypriots have discovered the joys of the British Christmas pantomime.
To start with, the Cypriots wondered what it was all about, but then it grew and grew until today. Inevitably, we will have sold-out audiences with both Cypriots and expatriates.
Last week there was a conference entitled National, International and Human Security in the Eastern Mediterranean. One of the speakers and panellists was Silvia Colombo, who comes from the Mediterranean and Middle East programme Istituto Affari Internazionali, or the IAI, in Rome. She was talking about the new regional order in the Eastern Mediterranean region, an inside-out perspective. What does that last bit mean, Silvia?
It means that if we look at the Eastern Med and we consider this as a region, we are naturally struck by its geopolitical features and the geopolitical forces that are driving what happens in this region. However, if we want to have a more accurate view and understanding of what's going on there, we need to unpack this geopolitical focus and see what lies behind it, or better said, at the basis of the geopolitical conflicts and competition in the region. And to do that, I claim we need to look at the domestic orders. The orders that are shaped by actors and processes at the domestic level. This means taking a more grassroots or bottom-up and inside-out perspective on the shaping of the regional order in the Eastern Mediterranean region.
And where do you start when you try to do that?
I start from the basic ingredients that, according to political science, comparative politics and sociology on the region, constitute the reality in front of us, i.e. the states, the regimes and the societies, bearing in mind that sometimes the boundaries between them are blurred. And so I introduced and used the term of hybridization as an explaining factor to make sense of where states in the region are heading to, how societies and regimes are being restructured, particularly after the shocks of the 2011 Arab uprisings.
And where are they heading? It seems to be an awfully muddled region. We keep hearing new things. We've just had Saudi Arabia trying to do reforms, women being allowed to drive, the arrest of people for corruption. Suddenly, people said, what? That's not what we expected in Saudi Arabia from the narrative that we've been used to hearing.
Yeah, indeed, Saudi Arabia is kind of a special case in many respects. At the same time, we can analyze what Saudi Arabia is doing, how it is behaving on the regional chessboard and also at the domestic level by looking at the state and the society within it. And we understand and we see how Saudi Arabia as a state is in itself very fragile, very weak, because there is a lot of contentious politics coming out from the society that is mobilized, and the extent to which the regime in Saudi Arabia, the monarchy, is trying, to secure its position vis-à-vis a growingly mobilized society is what is driving its foreign policy and its domestic politics.
You could say that of almost all the countries in the region, couldn't you?
Exactly. Countries like Egypt, Algeria, Lebanon and the others, including those that have been undergoing violent conflicts in recent years, can be analyzed by looking at the trajectory of states and regimes. And what strikes the eyes is that states in the Middle East and in the Eastern Mediterranean in particular have been traditionally understood as strong entities. At the same time, they are more and more fragile, more and more open to contention because of their lacking the ability to deliver on key goals, which is a fair amount of representation, security, which boils down to a very territorial and hard type of security, and the third element that states are supposed to provide to their population is, of course, a minimum degree of well-being. We can say that there's been a growing failure, particularly after 2011, by Middle Eastern states to perform these tasks, and this has opened up space for other alternative actors, some of which are non-state actors, to do that. We could mention, for example, ISIS, the Islamic State, that's been proliferating in the region exactly as an alternative, filling the void that has been left by some states in the region. The case of Libya is particularly interesting because in the midst of a very harsh conflict between the western and eastern part, we see that the southern region of Libya is completely in the hands of no one, and this is where non-state militias, tribal groups, smuggling and trafficking groups are proliferating and having their basis, which in the end also affects the stability and the security not only of the region itself but also of Europe.
How far do you think that you can lay a lot of what's happened in recent years down to globalization in the terms of the communications we have now, access to information from outside your country? All right, a lot of it may be false, but it's there. It gives you a different perspective. Has that played a role in the way the whole region is developing?
Yeah, indeed, it has played a very important role in two important ways. One is the extent to which communication, especially digital communication, has been at the forefront in helping people to mobilize and to get together, to connect, share ideas. During the Arab uprisings, the use of digital and social media in the wake of the Arab uprisings, during the topical phase, seen a spike because young people in particular have made use of these instruments as facilitators for their mobilization, for their getting to the streets, finding the courage to get to the streets and imitating and borrowing frames and references from other experiences, including those that were happening at the same time in Europe, like in Spain or previously during the colored revolutions in Europe.
Well, you can also see how frightened some governments are of the ability of their citizens to coordinate. You only have to look at how many times Turkey, for example, has blocked Twitter or any other social media thing to try and keep control.
Absolutely. They are frightened, they are scared, but at the same time they are also learning from the possibilities that are opened up by the use of digital and social media and tend to use them themselves in order to enforce their power. And this is, for example, the case of regimes and authorities in the Gulf countries, and Saudi Arabia itself has been making extensive use of these technologies in order to communicate, in order to try to also to buy the trust, the support of the population. But the second trend regarding communication technologies, or in general globalization, the globalization of communication that I wanted to mention, is the fact that identities and societies in the MENA region are not isolated from broader global trends, including the spread of globalization, messages, popular culture, youth culture that is really transnational. And so seeing and participating in this global culture, particularly youth in the MENA region, in the Middle East and North Africa region, have acquired new tools and also have learned from other experiences, and they have translated them into their local domestic context and used them as a powerful engine for mobilization. So globalization has really affected the region at the level of societies and is there to stay. I mean, there is no way that these societies can be isolated and can be put back into the kind of sort of
Pandora's out of the box.
Exactly.
Can I ask you how you think that the trends in energy are going to impact the region? Almost all the areas we've been talking about rely very heavily on the sale of oil and gas and fossil fuels, basically. And yet the move globally is towards renewables, towards transport being run on renewables and electricity and so on and so forth. So the power base of a lot of these countries will, over the next, I suppose, 50 years, possibly evaporate because they won't be able to sell their main exports at anything like the price that it's going for now. They will have to find new ways to keep their economies going, won't they?
Yes, they have understood this message, I think, but they are taking time to adjust, taking policies that can really curb their over-dependence on hydrocarbon reserves and revenues. Of course, this applies to some countries more than others. The so-called rentier states in the region, from Algeria to Libya and the Gulf states, of course, are overly exposed to this problematic. Take, for example, the case of Saudi Arabia, that has launched Vision 2030 as one of the attempts, a very visible one, in order to move the country away from a purely kind of public state-centric and hydrocarbon resource-based economy towards a more private and diversified economic model. The big question mark is how much time these countries will take to adjust to these new dynamics, taking into account the fact that if we look at the broader Middle East and North Africa region, actually there is a growing demand for energy coming from the societies themselves, I mean from the populations themselves. And so it is true that these countries tended to export and sell their hydrocarbon resources outside, but at the same time there is a growing demand internally that is driving the production, that is driving the exploration, and so on and so forth. So the challenge is twofold. On the one hand, yes, they need to revise their economic model towards more environment friendly, other renewables forms of energy to the external market, because also the transportation networks are going in this direction, but at the same time they have to change also their consumption model within their societies at the domestic level. They have to change the way in which people make use of energy, because most of the kind of energy resources that is supplied domestically is still subsidized. Take the case of Algeria, take the case of Egypt, and so on and so forth. And this creates, an overconsumption and an inefficient use of energy that is impacting hugely on the state resources and the state budgets.
So, what is the new regional order? When do you think we will know what it's going to be?
Well, looking at what's happening day after day in the region, particularly in these very turbulent times, one would be tempted to say that we will not see any regional order in front of our eyes soon, in the sense that there are too many variables, there are too many unexpected intervening variables at the international level, at the regional level, that are taking place and shaping the context. But having said that, I really think that it's exactly this unfolding of events with geopolitical competition, with domestic orders that are being remade, that is in one way or another shaping the region. So we have just to really look at what's going on and see that, of course, the time is one of conflicts, the time is one of geopolitical competition, and this is what we have to cope with. We cannot expect any magician to change the situation or to clarify the situation, because order in the end means some kind of configuration of actors and players and processes that is what we see already in front of our eyes.
That's Silvia Colombo from the Mediterranean and Middle East programme at the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome. Isa Blumi hails from Stockholm University's Department of Asian, Middle Eastern and Turkish Studies, and he spoke at that conference on Arabian leakage, how chaos in Arabia soils the region. I asked him what he meant by that.
We can discuss in greater detail the ambitions of Yemen's neighbors and what they're up to, but certainly the consequences of this now 3-year war, a rather brutal war that required enormous amounts of resources, has resulted in recalculations, recalibrations of strategic interests beyond the southern Arabia itself, as we see with the deteriorating relationship within the GCC between Oman and its neighbors, Qatar and its neighbors, the realignment of Turkey and its relationship with Saudi Arabia. All will have likely consequences in how the efforts in Syria transform, as well as the nature of the relationship Lebanon has with its immediate and longer neighbors as well. So that's what I meant by the results of not able to successfully secure Yemen as an area subordinate to Saudi interest has resulted in a bunch of recalibrations.
People tend to, when they think of the Middle East, I think of Western interference in places like Syria and then, of course, North Africa, Libya and so on. How much do you think that the public in the West understands the political significance of the Iran-Saudi Arabia conflict, if you like to call it that, and the power struggle, I think we should say it is, in the whole of that region? Because that bit isn't really to do with the West, but yet the way the West lines up behind certain of those players must have an influence.
Well, I would disagree a little bit with the emphasis of the question, because I do think Saudi Arabia is not in any ways in command of its position and role, historical role in the region. It's very much a subordinate to a much larger political economy of what Timothy Mitchell would call a carbon democracy. And certainly the ruling families of Saudi Arabia are faced with the constant realignment of power alliances within the family in order to maintain that role as a subordinate but crucial component of Western influence in this region. How it translates in places like Yemen has been as a result of many, many years of resistance, non-compliance, or juggling of, let's say, these possible consequences of the alliances that players in Yemen have with their neighbors and the larger world, is a sometimes confused narrative about actually what's going on. So, for instance, what may indeed be a struggle over what are the consequences of American direct intervention in Iraq certainly extends much earlier than 2003, for sure, does not necessarily play itself out in Yemen in the same way. It is an inaccuracy, to say the least, that Iran is directly involved in the affairs of Yemeni resistance to Saudi Arabia. It is very much a long-standing relationship, hostile relationship between Saudi Arabia and its neighbors to the south. Many Yemenis have very long memories of the violence that has been brought to this part of the world by Saudi Arabia as a direct ally of the United Kingdom first, then the United States, and that extends way back into the 1920s and 1930s.
I was going to ask you how you think things will play out, because we have to go back, don't we, to the carving up, there's no other way of putting it, of the region after the Ottoman Empire, the First World War and so on. That was the seed, wasn't it, that seems to have grown into this monstrous plant that doesn't seem to know what to do with itself.
That is indeed correct. Of course, these continuities that have emerged in subsequent decades, each new generation has faced a new kind of dynamic. whether with pan-Arab nationalism, whether it be the phenomena of expanding socialist orientation, the consequences of political Islam, the mobilization of Salafist Islam against what were otherwise very economical, deeply rooted cross-religious relations, even in places like Yemen. Obviously, oil economy, the political economy of oil extraction, the power and influence of Israel in the region with its strong alliance with the United States in particular, especially after the Cold War, has for each generation caused all kinds of adaptations and often in an unnecessarily violent response to what could have been easily resolved as a peaceful cohabitation, if you will.
Have you got any ideas about how the soiling of the region, as you put it, can be, if you like, minimised or completely cleaned up?
Certainly recognize the underlying currents and the rationale for mobilizing language like Shia-Sunni sectarianism, a rivalry between Iran and the rest, and how it's being exploited to justify rather violent attempts to sequester and secure the accumulated wealth of countries like North Yemen, or Yemen in total, would do us a great service. If we can avoid speaking about conflict in the Middle East in these rather reductionist ways, I think we can begin to start to appreciate what and why people resist in places like Yemen, despite the fact that they're under embargo, despite the fact that they have clearly no ability to defend themselves against airplanes that are dropping incredibly deadly, devastating bombs. They nevertheless will not concede to Saudi hegemony. And it's not about being just simple puppets of Iran or because they are Zaydi Muslims. It has much more to do with the immediate context of their lives in relationship with Saudi Arabia, and not this larger global phenomenon that we often phrase it as.
Isa Bloomy from Stockholm University, one of the panellists at that conference, whose latest book, incidentally, is entitled Destroying Yemen, What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World.
Keep up to date with events in Cyprus and around the world with the Cyprus News Digest.
Here in Cyprus we have a pretty rich cultural scene. A lot of it, if it's theatre, of course, includes Greek tragedy, Greek drama, performed very often in our ancient amphitheatres. But at this time of year there's a different scene in the theatres, particularly in Nicosia, because the Anglo-Cypriot Theatre Group puts on a Christmas pantomime. Now, it's a genre that I think if you're British you probably understand quite well. But it's extraordinary that this has now become part of the cultural scene here in Cyprus for many, many years, since ACT first put on a pantomime. Joining us to tell us a little bit about what the pantomime actually is Graham Thomas, who's the former chairman of the Anglo-Cypriot Theatre. Graham, it is a very strange theatrical genre, isn't it? Because girls dress up as men, men dress up as women. It's aimed at all the family, I think, but there's sexual innuendo, political jokes and whatever to keep the adults entertained as well. So can you sort of explain what it is about the pantomime that it's spread from the UK to many other English-speaking countries?
Well, I think it's because it is something original. It comes from the UK, as you say, and lots of British groups all over the world traditionally do it at Christmas time. Funnily enough, though, although it's traditionally performed at Christmas, nearly all the pantos, scripts and storylines have no reference to Christmas, although ad-libs can obviously sometimes mention the festive season. What's it all about? Song, dance, buffoonery, slapstick, local jokes, as you said, audience participation, and some mild innuendos. I think that humour is aimed at both adult and child audiences, with mild innuendos for the adults, which the children don't pick up, and some humour for the children that might just go over the adults' heads.
And there's a lot of slapstick, isn't it, and getting kids up on the stage and so on.
Yes, indeed. What I'd say is that, unlike traditional theatre, where you might have 20, 30 actors on stage and 300 people in the audience, in pantomime you have 330 people in the theatre all taking part in the pantomime.
So it's very much an interactive type of theatre, but it's extraordinary to me that, let's look at the situation here in Cyprus. It was first performed, I think, 25 years ago or thereabouts by ACT, and a lot of people wondered whether or not a Cypriot audience would warm to this type of theatre, but they have, haven't they?
Yes, tremendously, yes. Our first pantomime was in 1990, which I was lucky enough to be in. To start with, the Cypriots wondered what it was all about, but then it grew and grew until today. Inevitably, we will have sold-out audiences with both Cypriots and expatriates.
And loads of kids, because the schools now very often come en bloc, don't they?
Yes, they do. The schools, not just from Nicosia, where we present the show, but also from, I know this year, we have a school from Larnaca and a school from Limassol travelling up.
And what do you think the kids get out of it? Because there is a tradition in Cyprus of taking your children to the theatre. There's lots of Greek theatre specifically aimed at children, isn't there?
Yes, there is. I think what the pantomime brings to the children is something completely different, where they can let their hair down because they can see their parents doing exactly the same. The parents are booing the baddies, cheering the goodies, so the children join in. And one thing I would say is that many children in the audience in years past have then gone on to join ACT and become members of the junior chorus in the show, then the senior chorus, and have taken to acting and gone on to be professional actors.
This year, of course, you're doing Treasure Island. Now, you assume, I imagine, that the audience knows the basic story, because it's a very loose adaptation of whatever fairy tale happens to be the subject, isn't it?
Yes, and I think that's a good thing, that the audience has an idea of what's going on, in that, as you say, most pantomimes come from children's fairy tales, because they can enjoy the characters and the jokes and whatever, at the same time know that the story is going along to
a happy ending.
A happy ending, yes.
And usually a wedding of the principal boy, who's a girl, and the principal girl. And you're playing the dame.
I am.
And that's one of the things you do regularly, dressing up in these extraordinary costumes, looking like, well, tell me what you look like.
I don't look in the mirror, actually. But no, I look like a big, fat, old dame. And it's actually tremendous, because usually when I do make my first entrance, the kids in the audience, those who haven't been before, are absolutely astounded due to the deep voice which comes out. But then they just take to the dame, inevitably, because the dame is always the goodie, always. And it's just fun to interact with the children, getting children on the stage to help with the dame's magic act. Actually, that is the most favourite part for me, playing the dame, is getting the children on the stage.
Well, if you'd like to join in the fun, the Anglo-Cypriot Theatre's Christmas pantomime Treasure Island is being performed at the Russian Cultural Centre in Nicosia on Saturday, the 25th of November, so that's tomorrow. There's 2 performances at 3 and again at 7:30 p.m, Sunday at 3 p.m, and then next weekend again on Saturday, the 2nd of December, 3 and 7:30 p.m, and on Sunday, the final performance, December the 3rd, at 3 p.m. Tickets cost €14 for adults and €7 for children aged between 4 and 12 years old. You can get them by calling 99168 638 or emailing ticketsforact@gmail.com. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.